So dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me," and they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourself because you sold me here. For God sent him before you to preserve life for the families has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve, for you are remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children, and your children's children, as well as your flocks and herds, and all those you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty.' And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that his brothers talked with him."
Thank you, Hunter. My family is away today, not because of the house incident, but because they are both playing in basketball tournaments here in town. And Lindsay coaches my son's team. So they're at 2 different Jamestown locations, and I'll be joining them here in a little bit. Raise your hand if you are a basketball fan. Okay, good. I was hoping you did. Who do you consider the greatest basketball player ever? Okay. Opinions vary, right? Well, many, not all, but many consider Michael Jordan the best. And even those that don't probably list him in their top 3. And I read an interview that was done with Jordan. Marvin R. Shankin, this reporter, asked him about his regrets and disappointments in life. And this is how Jordan responded, and I quote, "I'm not the kind of person who has regrets. As soon as you look back and you come up with something you feel like you want to change, something else in your future has to change. To win, you've got to lose. To be successful, you've got to have something that's not successful. To be happy, you've got to have disappointments. So I think all those things have happened to make me who I am." End quote. Just like Jordan's reflections on the necessity of disappointments, Joseph of today's scriptures that Hunter read about, his life was a series of ups and downs, as we talked about with the youngsters. These ups and downs that shaped him into a pivotal figure for his family in all time. Joseph's story is a wild ride. As a teenager, he was his father Jacob's favorite, which made his brothers super jealous, especially after he bragged about his dreams where they bowed down to him. And we won't even bring up that fancy jacket. As a result, they sold him into slavery and faked his death. Joseph ended up in Egypt, where he went from slave to a prisoner to Pharaoh's right-hand man, thanks to his God-given ability to interpret dreams. Years later, a famine hits, and his brothers came to Egypt begging for food, not realizing Joseph was the one who was in charge. He tested them to see if they had changed, and that's where today's verses pick up. First, with the big reveal. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near. And he said, I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. If you've ever read Alexander Dumas's The Count of Monte Cristo, you know that the journey Edmond Dantes takes leading to his long-term plan of revenge on those that wronged him. Well, considering what Joseph's brothers did to him, he certainly had enough provocation to exact a big revenge. But Joseph says, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. All these years later, 2025, and you can almost hear those brothers' collective, whew. This Joseph had much power to do whatever he wanted with his brothers. Yet, he says, do not be distressed. Joseph explains, and God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not tarry. Why are we reading of this event in the Bible? Why is this story preserved for us and for all time? This story. Well, the obvious answer that comes to mind is that it shows how God's chosen people survived this horrible 7-year famine. Significant in biblical narrative that those people survive. But what about us Midwestern folks in 2025? What's the significance? You know how when you're a parent or a teacher or maybe both, as I know some of you are, you tend to repeat certain things many times over? Why do we do that? Because we have to, right? Well, because what we're saying is important and we want it learned, listened to, and remembered, hopefully. If you look at our scriptures today, something is repeated. And this repetition tells me that we should learn and hopefully remember it. So let's look again there. God sent me. God sent me. Not you, but God sent me. God has made me. Joseph endured some really harsh conditions, worse than any of us will probably ever experience. His own brothers beat him and threw him in a hole. He becomes a slave but ends up in Pharaoh's house only to be framed by Pharaoh's wife, which sends him down to prison. Sure, he gets out and gets this position of great power, but he could have avoided a lot of bad times had his brothers not done that to him. But what does Joseph say? God sent me. Not his brothers, God. Joseph says, God made me. This historical recorded event is telling us something about God. That our God is a verbing God. A verbing God. Now I can look out here, and I know also watching online, we have many teachers in our congregation. But for the rest of us, normal folks, I'll give a definition of a verb according to the internet. A verb is a word that shows an action, occurrence, or state of being. Using that definition, today's passages are showing us that our God is in action. If this is true, that God is a verbing God, does that mean that all the bad in our life is caused by God? No. But that's another sermon entirely. For today, think about God as a verbing God. Do we usually do that? We often tend to put God in the noun category. God is God. God is this omnipotent being. God is this being that we've named. God. This holy figure that did all these things in the past that we can read about. The most well-known things that God did, they're in the ancient past, right? God is God, a noun. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the greatest, 1 being the lowest, how much trust can you put in a noun? You're spending your life on this big spinning ball in the universe called Earth, in what sure seems to be a broken world. How much trust can you put in a noun to get you through this crazy, often difficult life? Your house floods with sewage, this deep. God is a noun. How much trust can I put in God? I'd say maybe a 3 or 4 on that scale. That's just me. Maybe you grew up going to church. Maybe your parents taught you from early on, to pray before meals, pray before bed. You have a general faith in this noun known as God. Not a horrible way to go about life, right? Yet, what is life really like when we live like God is a noun? How do we look at life's obstacles and troubles? When we're sitting at a 3 to 4 marks of trusting in a nouning God, when life gets hard, we tend to melt, fall apart. Melt because a nouning God isn't someone that we think can do anything. But what does this story of Joseph tell us about God? God sent Joseph. God sent Joseph. God made Joseph Lord of Egypt. You guys might be at a stage of your life when you can look back and see where God worked in your life. You might be at that stage. And that's good. You can recognize how in the past God has worked in your life. But also realize that our God, a verbing God, is working in your life. God works in your life. Speaking for myself, I've screwed up plenty of times. You know what I saw floating by in the sewage yesterday? And my feet were buried in it. I saw a wedding picture from my first marriage floating on by. That's irony. I've screwed up plenty of times. And I think of God looking over this chunk of clay named Travis and thinking, wow, I've had some great plans for this guy. But golly sakes, he just keeps messing up the plan. God is a noun. So I live life on my terms, not trusting God fully. Maybe getting to a trust level of God of 4. And then life knocks me down, and I turn to mush. Think of that house built on the sand, or the seed that's sown in the wrong soil. Now take any hardships you've gone through in the past, any hardships you're going through right now, and any that may come. But this time, know that God is a verbing God. God looks over this chunk of clay that's you or me, who has made mistakes, or even through no fault of its own, seems to have run up against some kind of hardship. Verbing God picks up that clay, which is mixed with some mess-ups, colored by some hardships, moves it around, mashes it some, rolls it some, puts it in a furnace for some refining, and bam! Out comes this wonderful new version, because God works in your life. Verbing God works in your life. When we recognize our God as a verbing God, how then do we live? When we have a history of mistakes, or when we come up against a hardship, and yet we know that we have a verbing God, what can life be like? When our trust in God is that of a verbing God, that 3 or 4 rating suddenly gets a lot higher. Higher because God, who is verbing all over the place, can take and use whatever situation you find yourself in and mold it into refining you into the person that God has always meant for you to be. Just as Michael Jordan acknowledges his past made him who he is, and Joseph recognized God's hand in his journey, we too can trust that our verbing God is active in your life, making something or someone wonderful. God has worked in your life too, even in the hardships, even in the obstacles, the tragedies, the uncomfortableness, the struggles. Yes, God has worked in your life, but our verbing God is also working in your life. No matter what is or will go on in your life, trust in our verbing God. Let's pray. Gracious God, we're so thankful for the faith that you give as a gift to us. Sometimes we don't completely live out that faith, and we tend to put you in some kind of stagnant category, but you are far greater. Lord, help us to remember on the hard days that you continue to work in our lives. Thank you for your goodness, God.